which I'm also a, oh, cool, real, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm also a trustee of a co-op that owns and runs a heritage building here in Stretford, and we raised community investment of over £250,000, and I'll talk about our experience of that as well. And I'm now a kind of cooperative and community enterprise advisor, and I work with Stir to Action, who are an organisation that supports the democratic economy. So yeah, I'm going to be drawing on these experiences for the purposes of the session, but I've got a feeling that, Gerard, do you want to just provide a bit of context for the session, and then we can just go around the room?
Absolutely. I'm gonna share my screen very quickly.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, please do. Yeah. Let me. I'll stop sharing. Over to you.
So let's see if this works. Can you see my screen here?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Great. So the context of this this workshop today is part of the development of Barking Dagenham's new Community Endowment Fund, which is it follows a decision by the council back in December 2020, which basically Cabinet decided to transfer part of the neighbourhood community infrastructure levy, which is a tax collected on new developments taking place in the borough, some of which actually funds the neighbourhood fund, which I'm sure a lot of you know about here in the room. They've decided to transfer part of that money to create a community endowment fund and to entrust Barking Dagenham Giving to set it up. So that's kind of the original decision behind it. And ascribed to this decision were three sort of core values. The first core value with that money is that we want it to be providing some sort of funding in perpetuity, so that in that sense, being sustainable for the future, but also ensuring that it doesn't cause any sort of negative social or environmental impact. We know that investments can be done in many, many different ways. You can invest your money into a bank or into some sort of funds overseas, and you don't necessarily know what that money is paying for. So we thought that it would be important to ascribe to it some strong sustainability objectives. A second sort of core value was it feeling like it's community owned, so that investment is of Barking and Dagenham, not of a specific organization, not of the council. And so we wanted it to convey that everyone has a stake or an interest in that investment, in that endowment fund, and that it should act as a force for convergence and cohesion in the borough. And then a third sort of core value is around governance. And that really means we would like the community to be involved in shaping, but also in kind of monitoring that investment in the future. And we've got some ideas on how we might do that. So those were the sort of the three core values around the endowment. And what we did is we convened a first sort of set of workshops back in March. We brought an investment expert in that workshop who talked to us about what she called ABC investments. ABC investments are meant to represent sort of the spectrum of different kind of investments that you can look at, from the A being avoiding harm, so making sure that if you invest in equities, or if you entrust your money to a fund manager and you say, please invest the money so I can use the income to fund activities, but at least make sure that you avoid harm, that you don't invest in companies that say drill for oil in the Arctic, for instance, or that don't respect human rights, these kind of things. So please do some sort of basic screening there. So that's one way, or one end of the spectrum. The B part is benefits, investing in companies that actively benefit people and the planet. So for instance, instead of just avoiding harm, also looking into companies that have really positive policies for their employees. So not just following the law, but also actually saying, what, we think that our employees should have extended maternity cover, they should have a certain amount of days off per year, in addition to what the legal requirements are. So Those are kind of the B companies, you'd say. And then the C element, which is around contributing to solution. And sometimes it's also called impact investing. And that brings us to a kind of a whole new dimension. That also means, looking at what a local investment model could look like. And those kind of ABC, framework is a quite interesting way to kind of look at the various spectrum of investment that we can do, like from the very kind of almost straightforward, you invest your money into some sort of fund that avoids harm, to actually looking at what would a local investment model, in this case the C investment, look like. And why are we having this conversation? It's because we've got the ambition to develop, well, we need to develop an investment policy for that money, right? We need to look at what are the decisions, what are the guidelines that we are going to ask whoever we work with, who's going to invest that money for us. What are those guidelines going to be? Do we want that money to be invested in sort of equities, in overseas investments, in a kind of A or B part of the spectrum, or do we want that money to be invested locally in Barking Dagenham or elsewhere in very specific kind of issues? So that policy is a very important document. It's going to be our guidelines for the future, and that workshop today is part of exploring what we want to put in that policy. And I'm going to stop kind of here, but one of the reasons we're having this conversation today with Simon is because specifically when we had that workshop in March with the community, we had about 40 people who took part in this. They said, wouldn't it be nice if that money could also have some sort of local impact? If we could look, just beyond the kind of investing abroad kind of thing, through a fund, and also have some sort of local impact. And Simon's job is precisely to look at what local investments could look like, and whether there's a way that we can work with the community, potentially also involving the community as investors themselves, and look at what a local model for Barking Dagenham could look like. I should just say before I stop talking here, that what we might come up with is, it might not be just either we go for A or we go for B or we go for C. Very often what happens in practice is that we might say, you know what, we want some of that money to be invested in a kind of very secure investment into a fund, and we can decide it could be 70% of the fund that we have. But we also want to reserve a little bit of that money for perhaps local investment or higher risk investment that we are not so certain that it's going to deliver a return, but we know that it's going to do good because of the kind of investments we're looking at. So, the framework that we come in, the investment policy that we come up with, in the end might be some sort of blended model where we have a bit of money invested abroad, a bit of money invested locally. Yes, and that's pretty much it. Two just very, very last word here is the amount of money we're looking at. I think is quite important. We're looking at the moment, an initial investment of £900,000, right? So it's just shy of 1 million. That gives you a little bit of the scale of what we're looking at. The second thing, and I think it's important to mention, is we are looking at how we are going to invest that money, not yet how we're going to spend whatever income we are generating from that money. The income will come, but it's not going to come tomorrow. And we have to also recognize that an investment will generate income, but the kind of a good return on investment would be 4%. So what is 4% of 1 million? It is not yet a lot of money. We're talking about 30 to 40,000 pounds in the first year. So I would invite you today to just focus much more on the investment bit of it. What is the model we're trying to build here? As opposed to thinking of how we're going to spend the income that we get from this investment. Is that all right?
That is great, Giro. This is great, and to be honest, you did answer a number of questions which I was thinking in my head while you were speaking. Obviously, I don't want to speak out of turn, so just want to understand, how do you want the format to be? Is it a free flow discussion, or is it a series of presentations, and then you will open up the floor for comments?
So I've got a presentation, but there's going to be a few breakout. We can have there's a few sessions to break out, stop at any point, and respond to comments. So, yeah, I'm gonna.
So I did have one question on Jerode's slides there. I think just before the ABC slide, you had core values there. Jerode, were those core values communicated by the council when they decided to put this money with us, or are these those three core values something that we came up with within the charity?
So for full disclosure, I was working in the council when we put up this policy. So we work together with officers and members in the council to agree on these core values. So yes, so it's kind of yes to both. We kind of shape these core values, but the council in the end adopted them, and the cabinet paper that agrees to set up the endowment embraces these core values.
Excellent, thank you.
Great, cool. So I will just take over screen sharing, if that's all right.
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, I'll just basically, I was going to do about 2 hours. So hopefully everyone's got that amount of time in the diary, but we will break out. So it's not just, you don't just have to sit there and listen to me whine on all morning. So this is just the outline of what we're going to look at. So I'm going to do an introduction to co-ops and community enterprises as a model, and then look a bit about how the unique kind of financing elements associated with that type of model in the context of the fund. I'm then just going to showcase a few examples of community and cooperative enterprise funds which are up and running right now. And then I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into one that I've been really involved in called the Community Shares Booster Programme, and talk about how that's becoming kind of a fund that's recycling and investing very patiently investing in community, locally rooted projects. And we'll break out and think about some of the considerations and applications for the Barking Dagenham Giving Fund. Does everyone, would it be useful just to do a quick go round the room, just for people to just say who they are very quickly, or do you all know each other?
I've not met anyone, no.
Okay, well, Olivia, if you could start with you, could you just, if you just quickly say who you are, and then just pick someone on the screen, and we'll just pass the baton around.
Yeah, that's fine. So I'm Olivia. I work with Right Development Sports Foundation. I'm their youth mentor. Yeah, that's basically who I am.
Thanks, Olivia. Could you just, if you can see the list of participants, can you just volunteer someone else to intro? If not,
Maggie.
I can pick Maggie.
Hi everyone, I'm the admin assistant here at BD Giving. It's lovely to meet you all. If I could get Vanessa.
Oh, don't think I can hear you there, Vanessa.
I hear you, Vanessa.
Oh, the mute. I'm Vanessa. I'm the founder of Moms on a Mission, and yeah. Next, I'm gonna go for Wumi.
Hello, everyone. I'm Wumi. I've been actively engaged in the borough until I did my own organization called Reading Ambition. So I know Barking Dagenham quite well, and I'm a resident. I've been here for many years.
Brilliant, thank you. And if you want to just, I think we've got Mo.
Is it Moise Khan?
Hi, I'm Moise. I worked for nearly 20 years in the insurance, investment, and asset management industry. I'm actually an CFA by profession, and a lot of the discussion today hopefully just falls right in my area of expertise. So I'm really hoping to be engaged in this discussion.
Great. Is that everyone? Sorry, I can't see with my screen share.
Cameron.
Oh yeah, Cameron.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Cameron. I'm the Learning Participation Manager at BD Giving.
Real, okay, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just kick off if that's okay. So, yeah, the first thing I just wanted to talk about was co-ops and community enterprises as a kind of a model of organisation. How many people have come across the term kind of know about co-ops or community enterprises, or is it quite an unfamiliar term to most of you, or is it something that you feel quite comfortable with?
No, I've never heard of it before.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to just do some very brief intro slides. So the first thing to really start with is the fact that co-ops and community enterprises are businesses, so they trade, and it's just useful to think about how they interact with social need. So basically, what we know is that there are a number of social needs that people experience every day. But just because they're there doesn't mean there's a natural market to address those needs. So we know that of all the issues that we face across the UK and globally around poverty, inequality, social injustice. And sometimes those persist because those in need can't afford or can't access the products or services that would enable them to overcome those issues. And the idea is that actually, we know that there's a strong charitable sector that is providing support and to a number of groups across the country. But the idea is that in certain situations, actually an enterprise, a community enterprise, might actually be able to identify a customer or a commissioner, whether that's a local authority or a funder, to either pay for a service or subsidise that service, so that the beneficiary or the service user can access the product or service they need to address those social issues that they're facing. So that's the idea, that actually community enterprises and social enterprises are trading organisations, but they benefit the community by providing a solution to a social need. So community business is kind of a really catch-all term. But what it really refers to is just any business that trades products or services. So we see these every day across the UK, and they're providing retail, so community shops, transport, community farms, community pubs, leisure centres. And the idea is that they are run by local people and for local people. And importantly, that any profits that are generated by the services are reinvested back into the community. So actually, it's about 9,000 community businesses across the UK. So, relatively it's a small proportion of the overall business base. It's about 2.2 million businesses in the UK. So it is a small proportion, but it is growing, and it's becoming a kind of an area that government and funders and policymakers are more and more interested in supporting. So it's just worth kind of explaining the difference between what we think of as a conventional business or a private enterprise and the difference with a community enterprise. So if we think about a typical business, often it will have one or a handful of owners, and so the ownership's concentrated. It's often there's some form of hierarchy of ownership where the investors, the owners, will hold shares in the business and they will have control. It's generating private wealth, so the profits are flowing to the owners, to the investors, and most businesses operate in order to try and their main goal is to maximize profit. And the shares in that business will what's called have kind of speculative value. So the stock market and things like that, basically people value the business on its speculative growth and its the prospect of it growing and generating more income. Generally, social responsibility, even though there are businesses that have quite strong social values, often they are secondary. So its primary goal will still be to maximize profit, and it will have social responsibility, but that falls kind of quite far down the hierarchy. And often they will just be there to often benefit a single stakeholder. It will have a primary stakeholder, and often those are the owners and the investors. Community enterprise kind of turns all that on its head. So the idea is that ownership is distributed as far and wide as possible. It's democratic. So the idea is that everyone has a say in how the organization is run. The wealth that's built up isn't distributed privately. It's common amongst all the community. So that's the idea of reinvesting the profits back into the organization because it's collectively owned. There's less speculation, so the shares, and we'll come on to this, don't increase in value. Often the social responsibility is the primary purpose of that organization, and it will have multiple stakeholders. So this is the idea of community enterprise as opposed to private enterprise. And co-ops are basically a form of community enterprise which have a very strong member ownership. So just to explain, so basically a co-op is a business that's run just by people like ourselves, and we will have a stake in that business. We may be customers, we may be employees, we may be suppliers, we may be residents. The key thing is that we all become members of the organization. So a co-op is a type of community enterprise that has as a membership, a formal membership. And as members, we get to decide how the business operates and how it's used. So co-ops are quite a strong part of the community enterprise sector because of these features. And a few of you might know so I'm based in Manchester, which is the sort of birthplace in the co-op movement. So you may know the story, it kind of is bandied around quite a lot, but essentially in the 19th century, there was a group of what are called pioneers who recognized that capitalism, as we know it, was highly unequal, and a lot of people were being disadvantaged by how enterprise was run. So a group of weavers and workers basically formed another way of doing business, and they came up with these principles around cooperative business. And they are now the kind of international principles of cooperation, and they sort of form the basis of co-ops across the world. Does anyone have any questions before I know I'm sort of going quite quickly, but does everything make sense so far? Yeah, seeing a couple of nods. Oh yeah, Mois.
Thanks. It does make sense. Thank you. It's actually quite good to understand this. I just wanted to understand how does this link to the endowment, community endowment investment?
Yeah, so I'm going to come on to that. So I just wanted to set the scene because basically,
thank you.
These organisations you can invest in them, and that's what I'm going to come on to. So,
thank you.
Yeah, just a bit of scene setting.
Thanks.
So, in terms of the co-op economy, it's actually there's actually a lot of co-ops in the UK and some quite large ones. So, probably all of you know the co-op store, the retail stores, the shops. So they're probably the most well-known one, but actually there are 7,000 independent co-ops in the UK. And because of the co-op group, and also you may have come across John Lewis, which is member-owned as well, they actually create a lot of value in the economy. So last year they generated £38.2 billion worth of turnover. And a lot of people in the UK are actually members of co-ops, about 14 million. A lot of those are members of the co-op group, but actually you can be a member of your local food co-op or your local transport co-op or your local community energy co-op. Yeah, basically these are sort of examples of community co-ops across the country. And the key thing about co-ops, the idea is that they can compete amongst conventional businesses, because actually by allowing people to become members of the business, they often will, it means the business will benefit. So we'll come on to this, but basically, if you become a member of a co-op, you're likely to customer. You potentially will invest and expect a lower level of return because you have a stake in the business. You might volunteer your time, which means that the business benefits from lower labour costs, and you access specialist skills from the. Sorry, I'm just getting. Sorry, I'm just sorry. So these are basically why co-ops often can be quite a valuable way of running a business where other businesses haven't been able to be competitive. So you see it a lot with pubs that have shut down because they can't operate in the private sector, but when they become community owned, they can benefit from all these advantages and are able to operate more sustainably. And then in terms of community cooperatives, the idea is that all stakeholders should be encouraged to become members and investors, and have a common purpose supported by all. And often the way that this happens is people share like a common purpose through an shared identity. So that might be in your case, residents of Barking and Dagenham. It might be that they have a certain interest. So it might be they're into community energy or into football and they want to own a football club. Or it might be that they want to take over a certain building. So you can see here's an example. This is Stretford Public Hall where I'm based. So we as a community came together to save this building. So that's often where the community aspect comes into a co-op, is that the community as a whole comes together around a certain purpose and identity. So I know that's a fairly kind of brief overview, but I was, given we're a fairly small number, it's probably not worth us breaking out into breakout groups. But I would like to get a sense from yourselves where you think the opportunity, before we talk about the funding aspects, just in terms of where we think there might be some opportunities for community and cooperative enterprises in Barking and Dagenham. So are there any areas of the local economy that you feel could benefit? And are there any assets, so land or buildings or services, which could benefit from being cooperatively owned or democratically owned? So yeah, I'd welcome any kind of initial thoughts just on those two aspects. Or do people feel there's very little? Oh, hi, yeah.
I think the creative industries in Barking and Dagenham at the moment, I think that could do with having a cooperative or a kind of community feel about it, because at the moment, I only know a couple of organizations that do a lot of creative work here, which is Studio 3 Arts. And I do know a range of other artists, but I don't think it's joined up enough. I know we've got CBD as well, which I was a cultural connector, but I don't think the creative space is joined up yet, because there's a range of creative people in the borough, but I don't think it's joined up. And I think that could do with a cooperative or a way of bringing people together, not just performing arts, but also maybe to do with other creative arts as well. So visual arts and other artistic things, I would say, that we could join up really, rather than just having one organization dominate the borough, or there's no joined up initiatives. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's a really, I mean, there's actually quite a lot of co-ops and community enterprises that operate in the creative sector. So often you will get, certain practitioners. So they might be, like you say, artists or actors or musicians. And what they'll do is they'll come together and form a cooperative. And it means that they can then, because they're a group, they can often bid for contracts, deliver services on behalf of funders or local authorities. But rather than that organisation be owned by one single investor. It's owned by the artists themselves, and they have a collective say and a stake in the organisation.
Can an organisation be a member in a cooperative?
Yes, yeah. So an organisation, so you can get co-ops that are actually, the members are the consortia co-op. So the members are all organisations as opposed to individuals.
Can you have a mix of both?
And you can have a mix of both, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, what you just have to be wary about with all those things is that if you've got quite these different stakeholders, that can add a lot of value, but also it can potentially present, it could also raise conflict if you've got organisations and individuals, and the organisations try to kind of steer it in one direction. But the key thing in a co-op is it's one member, one vote. So even if an organisation, a big organisation becomes a member, they only have the same amount of say as an individual. And so that the idea is that it's always a democratic organisation.
And to become a member, I guess you need to invest in the co-op.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the ways. So I'll come on to that in a little bit. But yes, some co-ops keep the participation amounts very low. So the traditional contribution used to be £1, and a lot of co-ops still do that. So it's £1 to become a member, and that's really good if you just want to build membership. If you just want to get as many people involved in the co-op as possible. But obviously, even if you had 1,000 members, if they're all just investing, just providing £1, it's not going to help the co-op raise capital, raise money. So often, and we're going to come on to this, they will then offer investment alongside membership, where people can then invest more money, and then that provides the co-op with that startup capital. But I will come on to that as we go on.
I think for one thing that comes up as a funder quite a lot is access to space. I'm just curious. I mean, I'm from Manchester, so I know Stretford Public Hall. But I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about like what that space gets used for to sort of help.
Yeah, so I think the hall is a good example of a growing number of. So as we know, there's a lot of buildings that are falling into delinquency, or they're falling into distressed ownership. So heritage buildings, especially, they're very expensive to maintain, but it's quite difficult to find organisations to take them on. So Stretford Public Hall is an example where the community at large, we took on this building and we use it as a multi-purpose space. So I'm sitting in a co-working space here, so we've got people working, and we get rent through co-working. We have a Victorian ballroom upstairs which can hold up to 400 people, so we're having weddings and events. We've got spaces for community use, for like wellbeing classes, yoga. So the idea is that this idea of multi-purpose, you're finding lots of different uses of the building, and because the community of our members, investors, they're more likely to use it. So we find that we have a really good participation. So people coming and attending our classes, getting involved in our workshops, that kind of thing. So, and again, because we have lots of volunteers, that keeps our costs down. We've raised money from our community, which means we're not having to borrow as much money. And so it just makes it more sustainable. But also the community know that they own the building collectively. So we can't go and turn it into a hotel or into a social club, a sports club, because it's owned by the community as a whole, and we're accountable to them. We're voted in as board members every year.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's sort of like multi-purpose space, because I think there's a lot of organizations that either can't afford or don't want to take on rent or ownership of a property themselves, but could definitely make use of it for, an afternoon a week, every other week or whatever.
Yeah, and I think again, there's quite a lot of what's quite good when you raise, if you will come on to how community co-ops can raise money, but that investment can go into, it's very good if you're investing it in buildings and capital, because you're essentially unlocking trading, you're unlocking, hopefully, we've just renovated the ballroom, which means we can now have weddings, so which we wouldn't have had before. So that's allowed us then to generate more income year on year, which then means we can not only meet our costs, but start to pay back our investors, which I'll come on to. Is there any
Simon,
thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yes, Simon, stir to action. Is that a co-op, or I'm sorry for my slightly ignorant question, or is that an organization that facilitates such community funding and partnerships here?
It's a good question. So Stir to Action is a co-op. So we're a co-op. So we're a worker co-op. So it's owned by the workers, and one of our main activities is supporting organisations to form co-ops and researching cooperation as a model in the sort of new economy. So, like I said, members there's different forms of co-ops depending on the members. So a worker co-op is just represented by the workers. A community co-op is where everyone becomes a member, not just the workers, not just the customers. It's anyone in the community that wants to participate.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll get through this section and then we can have a short break. But I just basically wanted to introduce, because obviously we're talking about a fund primarily. So I just wanted to talk about finance and co-ops and community enterprises. So again, I imagine some of this is sort of, you're familiar with this, but basically finance and social ventures and co-ops is very similar to in a normal business. It's the same, we use the same language, it's the same concepts, and the maths around finance is the same. The key difference is that finance often works the other way around in a cooperative or a social enterprise. So basically in a private business, it's the investment and ownership that determines how the organization works. Whereas in a cooperative, because it's the community or the people most affected by the enterprise that are in control, that dictates how the cooperative then will raise investment, not the other way around. So in business, often it's finance that dictates the operation of the business, whereas in a co-op, it's this social purpose that dictates how the cooperative will then raise its finance. So it's just a slightly different dynamic in how finance and enterprise works in a co-op. So cooperatives, like any other business, need capital, both as trying to get going, so what's called a pre-start, so getting to the point of trading, starting up, so just starting trading, and as you grow. So often, we think about, well, what kind of costs are there? So often it's, you have your development costs. So, before you start trading, it might be business planning, might need to register the organization. If you're taking on a building, you might need to get surveys and architecture fees and that kind of thing. Once you're trading, you'll need what's called working capital. So obviously you'll have money coming into the business and money going out of the business. And often you need some funding in the business to basically navigate those cash flow demands. So a good example is like in a retail business, you have to buy your products first before you sell them. So that's what's called negative cash flow. So you need the funding, you need some working capital to allow you to manage the business day to day. And then, like any other business, and especially community co-ops are often taking on assets and buildings, you need finance to purchase and renovate those spaces. So again, like any other business, co-op has the same, co-ops and community enterprises have the same financial needs. And basically there's really only kind of 4 ways that you can the enterprise can raise finance. Again, very similar to normal businesses. So obviously there's grants and gifts and donations, and they're great because they're free. But you know, how much of that is available to organisations? We know that we're in another kind of period of restricted public spending, and the availability of co-ops and community enterprises is more limited maybe than ever. So the other option is taking on debt, taking on a loan, and actually it's often quite, you know, if you've got a business fund, it can be quite straightforward or relatively easy to access debt finance. There's quite a lot of people willing to lend to businesses, but actually, you know, is the lending suitable for the organisation? Because essentially, as soon as you start borrowing money, you've got to, it commits the business to generating a certain amount of profit, a certain amount of turnover to be able to pay the interest and pay the loan back. And it can be subject to, it can be quite short term, and it can be subject to security and guarantees. So the lender putting claims on the assets of the business. Lois, did you want to come in there? Sorry if I.
No.
No, sorry.
Fine,
Okay,
thank
cool.
you.
No problem.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about equity in a bit more detail, but essentially, equity investment is the idea is a more flexible, long-term form of finance where the investor is connected to the enterprise by taking a stake in it. And I'm going to explain how that works in a co-op. And then the other form of finance, which often gets forgotten about, but is actually very relevant for existing businesses, is the idea of reinvesting your profits. So as an existing business, if you're growing and you're generating profits, you can then obviously reinvest those profits to you know, expand, buy a new building, buy new machinery, increase your working capital. So these really are the four ways that co-ops and community enterprises can access finance. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about equity investment, because that's the sort of area that I just want to focus on for the fund. So equity investment in companies normally takes the form of what we call shares or ordinary shares. So the idea is that you can buy shares in a company, and then you can, if you want, sell those to someone else. And often the shares confer ownership. So the more shares you have, the more control you have in the business because you have more votes. The problem with equity in businesses is that basically you have to be quite large to be able to provide an exit route for investors. So if you want to list on the stock market, which will allow people to buy and sell shares in your business, it's a very expensive process, and normally means that you have to be at least, you know, like at least 25. Often it's about £25 million the business will be valued at in order to justify kind of listing on a stock exchange. Often for smaller businesses, the way that they will allow their investors to get their money back is they'll sell the whole business to someone else. But that obviously isn't really possible with a co-op or a community enterprise because it's owned by the community. So you can't sell it to a third party because otherwise it's no longer owned by the members. So basically, the conventional form of equity isn't very, doesn't really work for co-ops. So as a result, there's actually a special type of shares in co-ops and community enterprises called community shares, and that's what I'm going to sort of focus quite a lot of the next session around. So has anyone heard of community shares, by the way? Has anyone heard of that term? Seeing a few kind of...
Not fully. I don't have a full understanding. I've heard it, but not really. Yeah.
Cool. No, I'm sure it's good. If you were all experts, then the next few slides would be kind of would have been fairly tedious. But basically, community shares actually refer to a kind of type of share capital called withdrawable share capital. That's its like formal name. And basically, it's a special type of share capital that's unique to co-ops and community enterprises, which basically provides a mechanism for members to invest and get their money back at a later date. So it's got like 4 features which make it very helpful for community businesses to raise capital this way. So the first one is it can't be sold or transferred to third parties. And basically what this means is because you can't sell it to someone else, there's no market. So the shares don't increase in value. So if you buy £100 worth of shares today, they'll always be worth £100. And that means that people that invest in these community shares, they're not really investing primarily for financial gain, because their financial investment won't increase in value. So it means that you can ensure that anyone that's buying shares really believes in what the social purpose or the community purpose of your organization, rather than just investing for financial gain.
Can I just confirm that would they always remain at 100? I guess they can still fall. They can't go more than 100, but
they can't go more than they can. Yeah, the organization can
fall.
Can write down the shares if they wanted to. But again, that is unusual. And we can pick up on that a bit later if it's of interest. But the idea is that primarily they're a relatively fixed value. The other thing is this idea of control. So because we've said that the importance of co-ops and community enterprises is they're democratic, then it wouldn't make sense that people could have more of a stake in the business if they bought more shares. So the key thing with community shares is you can buy as many as you want, but you'll always only have one vote. So if I bought £100,000 worth of shares, I'd still only have one vote. So it wouldn't impact on the democratic ownership of the organisation. The other thing that's actually really helpful is, as we said, it's actually very, it can be quite arduous and expensive to do a share offer if you're a private business, because you've got to get a lawyer involved, and then you've got to put it through a financial regulatory exercise, and it's all very expensive. And basically, if you're raising a relatively small amount of money, it wouldn't be worth your while, because you'd have to go through all this regulation. But the good thing about community shares is they're exempt from any form of financial regulation, which means that you don't have to do a huge amount of regulatory work in order to issue shares to your community. And then the final one is, I suppose, is the recognition that if you are asking people to invest in your organization, and the shares aren't going to go up in value, then in order to give a small financial incentive, the idea is that the shares, you pay interest on the shares. So every year, the investor will get often a small level of interest. That's usually between 2 or 5%. Again, the idea is that an organization shouldn't be offering huge interest, because it shouldn't be a purely financial incentive to invest. And by keeping the interest rate low, it basically means that the business is not having to pay a lot out in interest every year, which means it's got more funding to invest back into the organization, or pay to invest in its community purpose. So those are the sort of the key features. So why community shares? Well, basically they provide very long-term risk capital. So most people that invest in community shares aren't expecting to get their money back very quickly. The average we see is about 5 to 10 years payback. And that gives the organization time to build up, develop its trading, build up its income. Often community shares will help lever other funding. So essentially, if you do a community share offer, other funders will come in and say, wow, this organization has managed to raise £25,000, £50,000 for its community. That community must really believe in what that organization is doing. We want to get involved in that. So it kind of levers in other funding. as we've said, the democratic nature of community shares means that everyone can have an equal say and a meaningful involvement in the society, in the organisation. So it again stops a certain group or a certain individual taking control. And then the final one is about this idea of sustainability, in the sense that by allowing people to invest and become a member in the organisation, they've got a stake in it. So they're more likely to so an example of Stretford Public Hall, we've got 800 members. They often, come to all our events, come to our activities, volunteer, because they want to see us do well, because they have a stake in the organisation. So those are sort of the key kind of advantages of community shares.
Simon, you mentioned a few points on that slide and the one earlier.
Yeah.
I suppose what's obviously what we're all thinking, at least time, is community shares being a potential investment for Barking Dagenham giving. And you mentioned 2 to 5% interest, and I can understand, I fully appreciate that it can't be, obviously, the nature of these community organizations is that you're not looking to pay excessively out of these. And the trade-off there then is you're not only looking for financial gains, you're also looking for non-financial gains, like, for example, what the co-op does for the society and so on. Now, are there ways to measure the non-financial impacts of that? That's the first question. And then the second one, obviously, I'll wait for a slide where I can understand if the share prices can come down, meaning that if one wants to withdraw the money, can they actually get less than what they invest in the first place? I suppose they can, because nothing is obviously default free. A co-op can also fail. And then following that, the question would be, what due diligence can one do to make sure that they do back a co-op which is likely to succeed rather than fail?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. So I'll just, I think on the kind of social impact, community benefit, I think how do you measure that? And for me, that's kind of almost what the fund can kind of determine, because, and I'll come on to this, that because an institution can invest in a co-op, they obviously then have a stake in it, and you can basically kind of almost push that by you become a member. So the fund can actually say, look, if they don't think the co-op is, it's either it's no longer kind of meeting its community benefit, or then you as an investor have a say and can kind of mobilize the other members. So obviously there's that kind of reporting aspect where co-ops and community enterprises, like any kind of organization, will report back to their funders to say that we've supported this many people, we've done this, and the fund can decide how it wants to measure those things. But the added bit is saying you can actually influence them and say, by using your vote as an investor to say, oh, we would like to see more of this and more of that. So there are frameworks and measurements that that people use around social return on investment, and there's lots of different ways, and I will come on to some of that. But it's really, I think, for the funds to decide how it wants to quantify those features, and then how it works with its investees to one, get that information, and two, potentially influence them. So hopefully that answers that bit. On the due diligence, again, I will, if it's okay, I'll and how do you kind of make a informed decision around how that business might perform, and what kind of checks and balances. Again, if it's okay, I will just come on to that in the second half of the session.
Yeah, that's perfectly okay.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up about how an investor gets their money back, basically, with community shares. So there's a number of ways that all co-ops pay for basically return the investments back to their investors. So one of the ones that we see most is this idea of an open share offer. So the idea is that you have a number of people that invest at the beginning, essentially what the organisation does is bring in new investors over time to replace older ones. So this is I would say is probably one of the most likely models for a fund. So the fund says that we will invest X amount for say 3 years, but we expect our investment to be paid back after 3 years because we want you to go and replace us with new members. And the idea is that by that time, the co-op might have grown its customer base, so it's more likely to be able to attract more investors, or it might go to another organisation. Obviously, what the other thing that a society can do is generate profit reserves to then pay its investors back. So every year it could be making a surplus, and rather than investing that back into the organisation, it can hold that and then pay its investors back. There are other means, and I won't go into them, to be able to pay people back by again using depreciation, with the idea that if you're say buying a wind turbine, a wind turbine would say have a set life of say 20 years, and so you would be putting away money through depreciation to replace that wind turbine after 20 years. But rather than replacing that wind turbine, you could just use that funding to pay your investors back. So the idea is that organisation would only have a finite life, would only last for 20 years. So rather than so you use the depreciation fund, which normally would be to buy to replace the equipment. Rather than doing that, you pay investors back. So there's a number of ways that an organisation can pay its investors back. I'm mindful that I want everyone to have a break, so I'll just quickly go through a few last slides about community shares.
Simon,
so
just a quick question.
Oh, yeah.
You're saying that the shares typically would be invested for, or you like an investor would keep them for like 5 to 10 years. Is there cases where they can be exchanged earlier, like 3 years?
So yeah, I mean, what fundamentally because it's equity, the board, so the organisation actually has overall control, decision making about when and it pays its investors back, that's obviously a really important thing. That's the risk almost, and that's what makes the difference between equity and debt. Because in debt, the lender is saying you need to pay me this amount over this period. This is much more flexible. So say if the business has a bad trading year, and really, a good example is the pandemic. Lots of organisations had not anticipated having to close down for 9 months or a year. So it was with their community shares investors, it was very easy for them to say, look, we're really sorry, we're not going to be able to pay anyone back this year. Whereas for their lenders, they would have had to have a negotiation with the lender, and the lender may have had security and say, look, if you don't pay us back, we're going to kind of proceed with kind of taking on your assets. So it's basically a whole different dynamic, really. So obviously, as an institution, you can put down kind of additional terms and conditions around your investment to say you would like to see it back within a certain time. But there's always a slight risk that if it's going in as shares, that the society all fundamentally has control of its shares, and an investor can't. So the board basically can decide how and an investor, because the fund, like anyone else, is just one member with one vote, and it's just a single investor. It can't kind of compel or force the society to meet those commitments. So it's a slightly different, it is a slightly riskier, I suppose, proposition. But what my view is that if you're an active investor, the idea is that you kind of work with the organization and help them and build a good relationship with them by being a member of them, to kind of encourage them to meet a certain timetable that you set.
Yeah, I also feel, Jared, I also feel that there may be a reputational risk here if one tries to force the money out, or let's say insist that they get paid. So I get this is a very liquid investment. You put your money in there, and
yeah, and I wouldn't.
I guess yeah.
The headline would be.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say the headline would be: I wouldn't encourage anyone to put all their funds in this space, because it's riskier, it has a lower return. But obviously, as part of a portfolio, it's obviously very, very it's direct investment. It could potentially have quite a strong impact on a local project, but also it's repayable, so it's not a grant. So it just hits this kind of middle ground where, if you're a marginal business that has you're doing something that has high community benefit, but actually doesn't, financially isn't that high performing, rather than just putting a grant in and saying we'll never see that money back, this is just saying, look, we want to support you, we're investing in you. Yes, we appreciate it's risky and it might take a long time for you to pay us back, but we're going to work with you. So it's just a slightly different relationship, but obviously there are mechanisms that allow the money to come back and interest to be paid. So it does kind of fit within that kind of fund-like model, rather than just distributing it as grants, never to see it again. So
yeah, exactly. No, I do see that. I mean, I think to be very realistic, to try and get the money back through a board meeting is, I don't feel that's you're going to get anywhere with that, just because you've got one vote regardless of what money you put in there. And if you try and force the money out, you get bad reputation. I mean, it's a co-op. If the co-op doesn't feel, if majority of the members don't feel that it's the right time to pay or redeem those shares, then I guess you as an individual can't force that too much. Otherwise, you risk your reputation of trying to pull the money out from a co-op. Simon, how many co-ops in Barking and Dagenham? You may not know the answer to that. That have been running for at least 10 years. Yeah,
I had a look, and it's about 20 co-ops that are formed. That are in, a lot of them are like social clubs, because quite a lot of social clubs are formed as co-ops. And there's a few allotment societies. There's a couple of housing community, housing co-ops, but
exactly. It also depends on the type. Yeah.
So I would say there's not a big. I would say at the moment in Barking Dagenham there's not like a wealth of co-ops to invest in right now. But this is where the fund potentially, and I'll come on to this because I'll talk about the booster side. Well, actually, can you create new co-ops to invest in? By working with groups to say, you've got a business idea. Let's help you work that out. Okay, so you want to take on this building. We want to help you, and then we're going to invest in you. So there's a market making aspect to this as much as there is, let's just see what co-ops there are and invest in. Now, obviously, if this fund wanted to go and invest in co-ops nationally, there are lots of investments and projects. So that's just, so you could just invest in these and say, look, they're social investments, we like it, but they're not locally based. But again, that's just something
I would wonder what would be the advantage of this, though, because you would potentially take a large sum of money, invest it into a co-op that you have very little control of, that does not deliver local impact for the borough, and in which you have like one vote.
Yeah, I mean,
get less return.
Exactly. My view is this is definitely a lever, a mechanism to do local, place-based local investment.
Simon, how many of those 20? How many of those 20 that are running in Barking and Dagenham? How many of those have been running for at least 10 years? Sorry if you don't know the answer to this.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know about that actually, but
Okay.
And actually I would say quite a few of those would potentially not even be, because at the end of the day it requires the society to have a project and be looking to take on investment, and I don't know like where they are in their kind of their activity, but it's definitely something that we can. So Co-operatives UK has data on all the co-ops in the UK, so so if it's something you want to explore further, I can share a link where you can get that information about the sector in Barking and Dagenham. If it's okay, I'll just quickly run through a few last bits, and then we'll have a 5-10 minute break. So just under 500 groups have done share offers this way, and what's really good is about 92% of those are still trading. So it does demonstrate that it's a very viable way of supporting businesses. About £150 million has been raised from over 100,000 investors. And this leverage idea, so for every pound of community shares, about £1.20 comes in alongside it with grants and loans. So you can imagine that if Barking Dagenham invested a small amount of money, it could actually claim that it's then levering further funding, not only from other community investors, but from other lenders or other funders.
Are these figures nationwide?
Yeah, this is nationwide. Yeah.
Okay. And the 92% which are still holding today, how many of them have been, again, the same question, for at least 5 years? The thing is, if most of these are just a year, 2 year old, it probably doesn't.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is a relatively new sector, so quite a lot of these organisations will have launched in the last 3 or 4 years. So
okay. Yep.
Yeah, it's a relatively emerging market, as opposed to like a space that's been trading for a long time. Again, just to kind of give you a few, the average share offer raise about 300,000, and it's around 250 investors. Now you could say, does that mean that the average investment is about £1,000 per person? And actually, there's usually a very big spread. So often organisations will offer quite a low rate to community investors. So say 25, 50, £100. It's not nothing, but it is an investment rather than a donation. And then they will then access larger funds from potentially high net worths. So wealthy, socially minded investors are coming into this space because they like the idea of it and putting in 5, 10, 20,000 pounds. But so the idea is that you'll have a big mix of investors, from the very small investor to the large. But the key thing is everyone still has one vote, so you maintain that democratic nature. We did a bit of research into community shares investors, and it was quite interesting. So 40% are female, which is quite high compared to if you look at other. So I've used the term angel investors. That's like a comparator in the private sector, where you've got people investing in businesses professionally. Often obviously you need, in order to invest, you've got to have some level of disposable income, and but actually, we're not talking about hugely wealthy people always. So over half earn less than £35,000. It is predominantly characterised by white investors, so there's not a huge amount of diversity in the community shares space, but that again is something that we're really interested in kind of exploring. It's often there's a really interestingly, like when we surveyed community shares investors, nearly 3/4 had a university degree. So it seems to be like quite an educated, the average investor's got quite a high level of educational attainment. Slightly lower in terms of home ownership and employment. it's actually the average age of an investor is quite high, which I suppose makes sense because often, you know, it's when you're older that you potentially have got larger disposable income. You're potentially looking at how you can use your funding, your disposable income for more social purpose. So yeah, only 4% of investors were under 35. So just a few sort of characteristics of community shares investors. Now, in terms of shares, over 80% invested not because they wanted to. They supported the social or environmental benefits of the business, and actually only less than 20% were interested in the financial return, and just under half were invested because they wanted to have that democratic ownership of the organisation. And then just to finish, and again, this is just something to remark that while the southeastern is quite a large proportion of investors in community shares, there's actually quite a small number in London, and there's actually quite a small number of share co-ops and community enterprises using this in London. And again, this is something that we're trying to overcome. So there's actually a support program at the moment providing support to co-ops in Greater London, recognising that actually it's not a particularly active space compared to other regions. So again, this is something that Barking Dagenham Giving could potentially help contribute, grow this space that's actually quite underrepresented at the moment. So if it's okay, I was just going to take is everyone okay just to take a 5-minute break? And we'll come back at 25 past.
Yep.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll aim to finish not much after 1, so we'll rattle through. So obviously, most of what I've explained today is some of the investment models and how people are participating, investing in co-ops and community enterprises. But what I just wanted to do now is to showcase some funds that essentially may look and feel a bit like the giving fund that you're developing. Just really is kind of food for thought. So I'm going to show 3 funds, and I'm going to concentrate on the third one, which is the booster fund, because that's the one that's most linked to community shares, and I suppose is the one that I know most about. But in terms of funds, the first one I just wanted to demonstrate is this is a purely grant giving fund called Solid Fund. So in a way, this is less applicable to the kind of investment aspect of the endowment fund. It's just distributing small grants, but it's quite interesting in terms of how it mobilizes and empowers co-ops into actual decision making around a fund. So it's essentially a fund for the worker co-op sector. So these are all co-ops that are owned and run by their workers. So in Manchester, we have the Unicorn Grocery, which is a worker-owned cooperative grocery where the workers are the members. But you find other worker co-ops like Edinburgh Bicycle Cooperative, which is a cooperative, the staff of the bicycle company own the organisation. The thing with worker co-ops is they often find it difficult to raise funding because they can't, just like we said about co-ops, they can't just sell shares to anyone because it's owned by the workers. So Solid Fund was a way to basically raise some money for the worker co-op sector. And the way it works is it's like a crowdfunding model whereby worker co-op members, so 630, all contribute a small amount per week, so it can be as little as £1, into a collective fund. And then those members actually have a say in how that funding is then distributed. So it's actually released about 200,000 since it was established in 2016. And it is all its funding and its programs are aimed at supporting worker co-ops. So a good example was in 2019, the fund provided a small grant, $2,500 to the Birmingham Warehouse Cafe, which was a cafe based in a community space that was owned by, was privately owned, but they couldn't make it work, but the people that worked there wanted to take it on. And so it converted into a worker cooperative, and as part of their kind of setup, this fund providing a small grant.
Simon, how do they make decisions on how those funds are allocated?
Yeah, so that takes me to the next slide.
Okay.
So the decision making, so because the worker co-ops are distributed all over the country, they use a online tool called Lumio, and that's where basically members can create proposals and they can make decisions. And they basically have like a process whereby a proposal gets created, and there's 7 days of voting, and then they make a decision. But they do have some kind of controls around how the fund, to make sure that the fund can be maintained over time. So a key one is that they will never disperse over half of the overall funding, so they can recycle it. So I've seen there's a bit of a strange typo in that point, but basically they try and limit the operating costs, so the operating costs aren't taking too much out of the fund as a whole. And they do actually invest their retained cash to try and increase the value. So basically they have some decision-making principles, which, because it's a worker co-op fund, it kind of is quite linked to co-op principles around participation, transparency, accessibility, and simplicity. And basically the members can basically just have 4 options. So they can agree on a proposal, they can abstain, they can disagree, but ultimately it will go with the majority. But also they have a kind of a veto, like a block, which basically says that they don't think that a proposal actually goes against the fund's rules and would create unacceptable risk to the fund. So, so it's very, very participatory, and the members that contribute to the fund have a very strong involvement in how it works. So the next one I wanted to just talk about is what's called is the Community Spaces Loan Fund, which is run by the Cooperative Foundation. So this is a blended, so this is grants and loans. So the Cooperative Foundation is actually the charitable arm of the cooperative group. So the cooperative group being a multi-billion-pound retail organisation, they've set up their own charity, so they access funding from the business, and are now, I think it's actually, they paused it for the moment while they work with their current beneficiaries, but historically they've offered both interest-free loans and alongside grants, and it was targeted specifically on community spaces and projects that are focusing on community participation. So today it's been used around things like parks, community centres, and it's there to help those organisations develop their trading model and increase their income. So a good example is a project just down the road from me here in Manchester, which is Hume Community Garden Centre. They accessed a £50,000 interest-free loan and a £40,000 grant to support the build of a new office space and shop, which basically will increase the income to the garden centre. So they're basically expanding their trading services from selling plants to now providing office space and having a greater retail offer. So in terms of how that works is basically they are offering these interest-free loans. There's no repayments for the first year, and then basically it's they're generally offering loans on a sort of 3 to 5 year basis of payback. For groups in more deprived areas, they're adding a grant alongside the loan. And the idea here is that basically enables the organisation to, alongside using the loan maybe for more commercial purposes, they can also use the grant to add on more social and community impact. The Co-op Foundation basically worked on the assumption that at least 50% of the blended grant investment will be repaid and recycled into the programme. So that's how they managed it. They actually appointed like an investment advisory partner to do most of the day-to-day management of the fund. So they help identify suitable investment-ready community organisations. They do the due diligence, so they determine that kind of viability risk profile, and then they advise on what kind of structure the fund should take. And then their principles, obviously, again, align to the purpose of the fund. So, you know, is the organisation that they're investing in run for the benefit of the community? Do they manage, or do they have a meaningful stake in a space? Do they involve local people and more disadvantaged members of the community? And obviously, from a viability perspective, do they have realistic plans to develop trading activities and grow their income? And it's actually the Co-op Foundation trustees as a charity that make those investment decisions, but with recommendations from the advisory partner. So that's the second one. And then the third one is about community shares. So does anyone have any questions on those two for now? Or no, all good. Cool. So obviously we talked about community shares this morning. And basically, as we said, an organisation, an institution can invest in community shares as well as an individual. So the Community Shares Booster Programme was basically developed for this purpose. So essentially, it's investing alongside communities in community share offers, and it has been doing this since 2018. It's invested over £2 million now. And actually, I've just realised it's even more organisations that have benefited from the fund. But essentially, the way it's worked is Co-ops UK has secured funding from Power to Change, which is a charity. It's part of the big lottery. It's also accessed funding from Architectural Heritage Fund. So it's basically got built almost like an endowment, I suppose, in a way, that it's then distributing through matched investments. The aim of the programme is to basically help groups overcome key issues faced by trying to run a community share offer, so helping them with development, helping them with the fundraise, and then helping them to operate once they've done the fundraise. The key thing about the community share offer is it invests on the same terms as the community investors. So it doesn't take any separate conditions. So basically, the organisation doesn't have to treat the booster any differently than it does any other investor. So when it pays interest, it pays the same rate to the Co-ops UK as an investor as it would anyone else. If it offers money for withdrawal, it offers the same proportion of investment to withdraw as well. So an example of the booster is invested in lots of projects. Sorry, but one that invested recently was called the Clipper Inn in Plymouth, and essentially 165 people invested in this share offer to bring back an old pub and turn it into a kind of community space. So the booster invested 100,000 alongside the community, and that's basically enabled this group to take on this space and convert it into a community space with a market, a pop-up cafe, and also 2 flats on the top floor, which provides a kind of stable rental income. So in terms of how it works, there's basically 3 pathways of support. So this idea that it's helping groups do community share offers as well as investing in them. so there's this pathway one, which basically some of that money that is received from its funders is actually distributed in grants of up to £10,000, and that grant is then to help that community prepare for their community share offer. Once it's prepared, they've used that grant to get ready and they launch their share offer, then the booster will invest up to £100,000. But it will also, I'll come on to the kind of conditions of the equity. There's then two other pathways for more established groups that just want to take a development grant. So pathway 2 is for those that don't need a development grant and are about to launch a share offer. And pathway 3 is for groups that maybe already have a share offer in the market, and the booster can just invest in that share offer once it's live. The development grants, basically that £10,000 is there to help the organisation get what's called investment ready, so help them with their business plan, community engagement work, set up their legal form. It can also be used to help them promote their share offer. Marketing, maybe creating a video, social media, advertising, that kind of thing. So in terms of the equity, Co-ops UK is the investor, and it basically holds those shares when it invests. The investment will never exceed more than 50% of the society's overall shares. So that's why it's a match fund, because it doesn't want to be a majority investor. So if the society only raises £50,000 from the community, then the booster will only put £50,000 in. If the community raises £150,000, then the booster will go up to 100,000. So that's like a kind of a ceiling on the investment. The share offer needs to have met its minimum investment target. So again, a share offer generally will have a target that it's aiming for, that it determines is the amount of money it needs to deliver the business plan. So it has to meet that minimum target. If it meets its target, priority is given to the community. So the idea is that the booster will. So sometimes the booster has made a commitment to invest in a share offer, but actually never invests because it raises all its money from the community. And that's quite good, because it's sort of saying, look, if we don't need to be in, then we won't go in, because we'd rather the community be invest. But if that organisation needs that capital, then it will invest. And again, in terms of withdrawing, the Co-ops UK will only won't withdraw any more than the maximum that any other member would request. So again, that's usually done on a percentage basis. So if Co-ops UK has 50% of the shares in that venture, if the organisation says we're going to allow, say, £10,000, then Co-ops UK would be eligible to take 50% of the money that's available to withdraw, because it has 50% of the shares. So that's sort of the mechanism for withdrawing. So this is one of the added things around the booster program, is that Co-ops UK isn't just an investor, but it's also a member of the society. So it actually gets involved in the society in terms of it will assert its membership rights. So if it will request information that it feels it needs from the society, it will scrutinise the accounts of the society, but it will also kind of encourage the society to access governance support and advice. It will attend the AGMs, so it's quite a visible member as well as being an investor, and that's this idea of becoming kind of you're more than just a passive investor. You're an active investor, and you're supporting the organisation as it trades following the investment. So yeah, just the portfolio as it stands at the moment. So just over £2.7 million have been invested in 48 organisations. The average investment is 77,000. It's actually levered in. So for every pound of booster, it's for every pound of booster, £2.80 of community investments come in. So it's actually levered in about £7.6 million worth of community investment from over 10,000 investors. And almost half of those organisations are based in areas of high deprivation. So it is focusing on areas of disadvantage. And the pie chart can hopefully show you the distribution of the sectors. So it's invested in quite a lot of community hubs and community spaces. After that, like community pubs, shops, cafes, housing. It's invested in energy, shops and cafes, sports facilities, health and social care, and it gets progressively smaller.
Simon,
but it has.
Simon, just for the sake of time, just wondering whether we could. Just wanted to ask whether any of the people on this call there's quite a lot to take in, I suppose.
Yeah.
Firstly, to acknowledge. The second I wanted to ask is whether there's any kind of one of these models that kind of speaks to you, or whether you thought that this could be a potential model that could work in Barking Dagenham. Just wanted to see if there is any kind of thoughts or questions, perhaps regarding any of these kind of models that Simon has presented.
Yes, I think a lot of these models could actually be good for Barking and Dagenham, especially this booster. It will definitely help a lot of organisations out.
Yes, the booster is the equity one. This is the one that's investing in community shares, so it's the long-term investment. But that's it's good to hear. Anyone else had any thoughts?
I think that quite a few of the smaller organisations that try to do things within Barking and Dagenham would really benefit from quite a few of the different, especially I agree, especially the booster. Yeah, nothing really more.
Are you aware of any kind of community spaces or places which are used or would be used by the community if there was such an option to take over, kind of a space and kind of raise funding?
There aren't actually a lot of spaces within Barking and Dagenham. A lot of people struggle to get spaces to be able to do clubs. I know firsthand through working at a basketball academy. A lot of the other teams around the borough haven't got anywhere for their training, or we're quite lucky because we've found our base, but it is difficult.
Yeah, so I think
that's true.
I think that shows why you need that kind of grant capacity. You need that intensive support to help identify and opportunities and work with communities. So that development grants is, for the booster has been really important. Like, in a way, it's been the way that we've been able to create a pipeline of projects and then invest in. So it's like, having that grant aspect creates your pipeline because it helps them get to the point that they're investable.
So one model, if we look at the endowment fund, would be to say, right, we've got this capital there, which could be, I don't know, maybe £200,000 or something, and we're going to use it to set up a booster program, whereby we will provide small grants for groups to get together and develop their proposal as well. Not only small grants, but actually active support, perhaps, bring in various sort of kind of professionals to help with the business plan and so on. And then that group will then kind of raise community shares, so from the community, and might be kind of match funded by that grant, by that booster program. Yeah,
that's the model, that you match. You're not the only investor, because of the idea of a co-op. A co-op is benefits from having a wide membership. So you need to bring in the community to be investors and members. It may be that it isn't always 50% match, but that we found is the sort of simplest way of doing it.
So in that case, how do you make sure that money is sustained in the long term? So say you support 3 projects in the first instance, one doesn't succeed beyond the development. It just wasn't a good idea, or I don't know. 2 others go to raise community shares and manage to raise, get booster funding. Both of them for 50K. So you've got only 100,000 minus, the development cost. You've got only like £70,000 left in your pot of money. Where do you go from there, and how do you support more models, more ideas?
Yeah, so this is the thing. So I think obviously we've been fortunate that we've got quite a large amount of money that we've had over £3 million. I think it's just under 4 million. So we've been able to distribute quite a lot in grants, and it's fair to say that we have distributed quite a lot of grants that then didn't get anywhere. Because the groups weren't able to get to a point for whatever reason. So I'm just having a look. How many? So 62% of the organisations who received development grants went on to launch a share offer. So about like over a third, we gave a grant, and they, despite their best efforts, didn't get to the point where they could launch the project and then be invested. So you do have to factor in a certain amount of wide kind of grants that won't create pipeline. In terms of the once you've made the investments, like how do you what's the time frame for starting to recycle that? So again, we've been fortunate that we've been investing quite slowly. So we've still got capital to invest. We're not even dealing with recycled capital because we've been investing about £1 million a year. Like it scaled up, it went like 500,000. So we're still using our overall funding. In terms of the payback period, it is a very slow process. So I've got a slide here. At the moment, we've only actually received £32,000 back, because most of these projects will usually have about three-year suspension on, so they won't start paying interest for 3 years. They won't allow withdrawals for 3 years. So we've got about £20,000 worth of interest back and about £12,000 of capital withdrawn. So actually, we've only returned about 1% of the portfolio so far. So we know. In terms of the portfolio, we have we've mapped out the kind of how the portfolio kind of performs. So you can see we've got a spread of interest rates. So we have invested in ones that have a fairly low return. Most of them are at 2%. And then again, we've got like a similar spread around the amount of time before we can start withdrawing our capital. Majority of those are after 3 years. And given that most of our projects haven't been trading for 3 years, not much capital is coming back yet. So it is like I say, it's a patient, riskier end of the investment space. But our feeling is it's a way to support very local community-based projects with a form of finance that isn't just a grant.
Sorry, if I could get a little bit more understanding of this. So with the booster, do you have to pay them funds back after a little while, or?
Yeah, so the organisation basically gets to decide. the time frame, and so this is sort of the difference. Is like the organisation says, look, we're going to raise money this way, and this is our proposition. We're going to pay, so that they get to set, the organisation gets to set the terms and conditions. So they can say, look, we're going to aim to pay 2% after 3 years, and we're going to allow people to get their money back after 3 years, but only say 10% per year. So it's the organisation sets the terms and conditions, and then it's for the booster to decide if it wants to invest on those conditions, based on those conditions. So it's not us. We don't go around saying, we've got this funding and this is the terms and conditions. If you want this funding, you've got to achieve X, Y, and Z. Rather, it's the organisation that gets to decide, and then we decide whether the booster decides whether it wants to invest or not. So,
for instance, if it's like a purely charitable organisation, the only way for them to raise funds back would be doing something like crowdfunding. So would that be like the way they'll have to kind of pay it back and stuff?
Yeah, that's what. So first of all, you can see we've actually invested in 5 projects that are not going to offer any interest. So first of all, we've given that money and we're not expecting to get any interest on it. So again, because it's part of a portfolio, we feel we can do that because it's not every project. And then in terms of getting our money back, yeah, we've invested. The booster is invested in projects that have said, look, we can only pay you back if we raise this money from our community at a later date. So we've kind of, again, just to flash up another slide, we've basically got this risk profile. So we've set a risk score for each project about the risk of getting our money back. So while we've tried to keep most in the low risk area or the lower risk, we do have a few which are like fairly high risk, like we're not. But again, it's tricky.
How do you calculate the risk? How do you figure out what is more risky than others? Like,
yeah, it's difficult. I mean, basically, the process again. So there's a panel. So the booster has a panel of kind of an investment committee, basically, that's got various different people on it, and they collectively look at the business plan and look at so the key thing is the business plan. So we'll look at the organisation. They will have like a plan about how they, because as part of the community share, you've got to say how you're going to use the money, how it's going to generate income in the long term. So basically, it's just a question of looking at the business plan and the share offer and saying, we think this has got potential. And yeah, just to, I know we're finishing. So there's some eligibility about what it can invest in, and a lot of that comes from our funders, Power to Change. But the panel, but we also have this investment framework. So these are the things that we ask. We look at, so every investment proposition applies. We'll look, is it eligible? Does it fit with the program? Does it have a strong community benefit? Is there, what's the, is it targeting disadvantaged or deprived communities? Are the group willing to engage with best practice around the share offer? What's the geography and sector distribution? Do they emerge from an underrepresented sector? Is there anything innovative about the business model? And then obviously the last 3 are the more financial ones. So what's the risk and what's the return? Because actually, if it's got a high return and a high risk, we might be interested as part of the balanced portfolio. But if it's quite low risk, but quite low return, again, that's potentially of interest. And then withdrawability of funding, how long will it take to get the money back? And then leverage, what other funding is coming in? So these are the things that are influencing the investment decision, and the committee makes an informed decision based on these aspects.
So what would be so the question the example I used earlier around with £200,000? This feels like it's way below what would be needed as a minimum to establish a booster program. What would be kind of a reasonable threshold?
Well, I mean, I think yeah, and I think we found that there's a sort of, one of the asks that we did a £1 million pilot, and then we got an additional £3 million, and that was basically our prospect is that we'll invest. We're investing most of it early on, so it's like there's quite a high number of investments early on, and then the idea is that as that money comes back, so while the booster will invest in an ever decreasing number of projects, the view is that it should, unless we can raise more capital, at the very least we should be able to do about 2 or 3 per year after about year 5, but that's based on 4 million. So my view is that either the Barking Dagenham Fund tries to lead, but it tries to attract other funding in. So it actually uses its fund to say, look, we want to get this going, but you talk to the GLA and other partners to say, can we increase the pot, or you just do something very targeted that says we're gonna like work with a small number of groups intensively, and we're going to try and invest with them, and that's just going to be a small number. That's going to be a very small part of the portfolio, and we're not going to see it as like a massive component of recycling the capital. So you just do a small kind of defined targeted intervention. So that would be the two, for me, it's either you kind of try and crowd in other funds to start building a pot that can get to a critical mass, or you just see it as like a little targeted intervention that you can, I hope, do quite intensively with a small number of groups. Cool, so we're just past 1 PM. Did anyone have any other thoughts and questions?
I have a question.
Yes, yeah.
So if you were going to do like a small targeted group of people or organizations, how would you go about, or what would you advise? How would you go about doing that if you wanted to do that?
Yeah, so I think it starts with the business idea. So you've got to try and work out if there is a group of people that all have a shared, so if I just flash back to the slide that I think is the real kind of starting point for any sort of community cooperative project. So is there a group that shares this community purpose? What kind of informs that? And then the idea would be to basically work with them on their kind of proposition. So what's its, what there has to be with a community enterprise, there has to be some form of trading act. For me, you've got to start there. So what's its trading activity going to be? And then understand the capital requirements. So if it's like, okay, we need a building. Okay, so can we find a building? How much is that building? Are we going to need 2 years of working capital before we can start? So you then try and work out the capital requirements. And then from that, you can work out your funding need. And then I would say then it's about creating the organization, registering a co-op and building and getting your governance and getting your board that we're going to drive the project. And then potentially that group can then go out and start building membership, raising investment and doing the fundraising. So it has to start from the sort of business proposition. But once you've done that, and I suppose the other bit is that community engagement, is going out, talking to people, using social media to see if there's an appetite for what you want to do in the community. Okay.
I also have another question. You suggested that you said I wrote it down actually. Let me just get my notes. So if you were going to get, because I don't think I know we've not done this before in Barking Dagenham, are we going to get, maybe this is to Gerard, I don't know. Are we going to get an investment advisory partner, or I don't know, specialist? Because since you've not done this before, what are your thoughts around that, Gerard? Because that's quite important.
Absolutely. I think the whole kind of due diligence thing, not only, I think both. So in terms of the development of ideas, you know, for groups in the community that would want to build a proposal, I think there needs to be support. So that's one thing that we would be exploring if we decided to go down that route. So money and support, coaching, for instance. And then in terms of making the decisions on behalf of the endowment fund, I suppose, we'd want to involve a group of people of the community to help shape those, but they will also be working closely with people who've got investment expertise and who can help with the due diligence. So again, all of that is kind of in the open at the moment, and we don't know exactly what it was going to look like. But I think what's important is we need to recognize that whenever we need specific expertise, we will draw on that specific expertise to help inform. And I should mention that Moise, who was here on the call earlier, is actually a new trustee of Barking Dagenham Giving, and Moise got, you know, as he said, 20 years experience working as an investor himself. So, you know, we can draw on those resources as well. You know, people who've got, you know, who are who do that on a day-to-day basis and can help inform or, you know, raise flags whenever they need to be raised.
Okay, I was going to say I did like the, I know a lot of people love the community in Booster, but I didn't like the community foundation model. I mean, because that seems like they already had a co-op, and then they now had the foundation element come out of it, and then now started investing. So I did like that model as well. I know people are talking about the community in Booster, but I looked at the co-op model, and I like the fact that they were already a co-op, and then they now drew on that experience to now have a foundation where they can now invest into and then share that for the community as well. So I did like that model.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in terms of the fund, obviously for them, because they're putting in loans that are quite short term, the payback's much quicker, because they're talking about £50,000 loans that are paid back within 3 to 5 years. Now, obviously, they made it very affordable for the organisation, or as affordable as possible, by making it interest-free, having a payment holiday for a year, adding a grant. So it's a very soft loan in one sense, but it does have more certainty on the payback. The community shares, it's, you know, you're rolling the dice with the organisation, and, you know, the fund is you know, is in with all the other investors and doesn't have priority, whereas the loan has priority. So again, it's getting the balance, because you know, for the fund, I'd say like that kind of loan offer is obviously it's a less risky proposition, but it's actually like, are there organizations that can take on that kind of finance? Because it's, you know, even a £50,000 loan is quite difficult to pay back within 3 to 5 years. Whereas the community shares investment could be in for 10 years, you know, it's much, or even longer. And actually the board can decide at any point to say, no, we can't pay it this year, which is quite have the same. So yeah, I think, you know, it's always that way, it's balancing what, you know, the kind of responsibility to make sure that the fund, you know, your funding is, you know, you're not kind of being too cavalier and investing left, right, and centre and too risky, but at the same time making sure you've got a proposition that potentially marginal organisations can, you know, if you want to really prioritise local community impact, then, you know, it's
be away.
So it obviously is a balance there, and you know, it's not always easy to say this is the way to do it. But hopefully today I've just shown you some of the possibilities, some of the models.
And I think it goes back to the point I was making at the beginning, which is it doesn't need to be a, you know, all or nothing. So we could decide that we take the endowment fund money and we'd split it in, you know, somewhere in the middle. You know, we could decide that we invest a large chunk of it in something that is a bit more secure, that's very much kind of spread across very secure assets, and not necessarily looking at local investment. Then we could take part of that money also to look at then a local investment model, of which those that we've seen today could inspire or help help define what we want to do locally. And that way we know that if we lose money on one end, we can still count on the the income generated by the more secure investments. We could even imagine that some of the kind of the income that's generated by the secure investment is re-injected into the local investment fund as a way to top it up and to kind of mitigate for some of the losses.
Yes,
so that's another option that we could look at.
And I suppose that's the other thing is about sequencing and timing. It might be this bit doesn't come in until slightly later, because you've got a more established pot that is generating with returns, and then that helps then that could just start setting up your grant pot, your development grant, which is then just creating your pipeline. And then so you could be talking maybe like 5-10 years away before you're making your investments in these local projects, because you've spent quite a long time capacity building. There's that element. This is a long-term thing in certain instances. So food for thought anyway. Does anyone have any last comments or questions? Or I know I covered a lot of ground, and it was probably quite a lot to take in, but I'll send the slides across and then you can share them. And
we're gonna thank you so much. I mean, there's been a lot to take on again, but that's because it's a new area for many of us. But what we will do is we will put the video online on the Endowment Fund webpage on the website, and this is part of a kind of it starts to build knowledge around the various options that we have there with the money. By no means is this the kind of the end of this process of research and engagement. Obviously, there's a lot more people that we would like to engage with. I think we also need to get some surveys out there in the community to kind of see whether there is any appetite for stuff like that. And we will take the time we need to take to actually make sure that people are on board and really feel like it is something that can work locally. So we're not trying to speed things up here and to get to a point where we decide. In fact, just to let you know, the endowment money is going to be transferred to Barking Dagenham Giving possibly in July or in August. What we will do is we will just put it on a secure account, so it's like a place where the money is like entirely safe, and we know that we're not losing anything, so we're not gambling with that money at all. We're just like putting it on a bank account, actually spreading it across bank accounts so that it doesn't there's no risk that the bank going down we lose the money. And then once we've kind of come on the other side of that discussion with the community, and once we've got an investment policy that we can all agree it would be the good one for Barking Dagenham, then we will take that money and invest it according to what has been decided. So, let's take a bit of time, because like I said, it's not the return that are going to be generated immediately that we should be looking at. It's the model that we're building for Barking Dagenham.
No, sounds good.
Right.
Well, hopefully, if this is an area that you end up wanting to explore further, then we're obviously more than happy to provide, because we covered a lot of ground fairly quickly. But
should we just before we close this meeting, just to plug that we're working with Cameron and the team on the establishment of a steering group, and we will be issuing invitations for that. So we would like the steering group, hopefully you might want to be involved in that, but we'd like the steering group to be involved in kind of the harder, more technical aspects of development. And we will, of course, then look at how we can cover for your expenses for doing that. So we'll be making an announcement very soon about an invitation to becoming part of that steering group, and we hope that this will be a way to engage on a more regular basis with a certain group of people who can then pay for their time and help us go into the nitty-gritty of some of those questions, because we think that it's going to take a bit of time to get there.
Great.
All right.
Well, lovely to meet you all, and thanks for sitting through quite a lengthy technical session, but I hope it was of interest.
Thank you.